and we're going. So, Dr. Jane.
Hello.
Welcome. Where are you? What time is it?
I'm in New York and it's 6:05 in the morning.
Wow, you're very glamorous for 6 a.m.
Thank you. I wish I could say I'd been up all night, but I haven't.
So, look, first of all, tell me who you are, what you do.
I'm Jane Thomason. I'm the CEO of a company called Apt Associates. I run the part of the company that looks after Australia, Asia Pacific and London.
Okay, and just because I think it's quite important for the context here, you're someone that has set up and run like a really big corporation, I'm not going to go into all this, but I'm guessing lots and lots and lots of zeros at the end of it. But your focus right now is doing on stuff that's kind of social impact, is that right?
Yes, so I set up my own company and about 5 years ago I sold it to an American company, but and they wanted me to grow the company, and so the part of the company that I look after is over 200 million revenue and we have 650 staff. All the work that we do in the company is around social impact, and I've made a particular interest of mine over the last couple of years really trying to understand how blockchain is going to be able to accelerate that impact in developing countries, which is our focus.
Okay, and I think that's really important as well, or is for me at least, because you know, you get a lot of people who work for NGOs who are, like, say, well-meaning, but a lot of people might dismiss because they don't think they understand the economy, they don't understand kind of big business, but you see both sides, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I've spent 30 years working on implementation programs in developing countries, so I understand what it takes to execute in those settings. And I'm also realistic about how the uptake of tech might work, which perhaps other people have less of an understanding of, because there's cultural issues and governance issues and infrastructure capability issues that all have to be taken into account to get something like this in the field and scaled.
Okay, so look, I'm loving seeing the business side of you, because I've obviously had a beer with you and know like Jane with that smile. But look, not that of course you need to smile, that's completely not part of it, but tell me, give me some background, tell me why you're doing what you're doing. What's your motivation?
So I've always wanted to do things that have an impact on the world. I kind of feel like you have one life and you need to use it to its best effect. So, you know, from an early age, in fact, my mother took us on a community aid abroad Oxfam trip to Indonesia. I was about 14 or 15. And so we went around visiting their projects and I was really moved by what I saw. And I met an Australian woman in Central Java who was a social worker and a volunteer and had been working for 14 years with very, very poor communities in Central Java. And it was that sort of gave me the inspiration to move into working in international development and in fact shaped some of my academic choices. And I went, after I graduated from my first degree, I went straight back to Indonesia as an Australian volunteer, which is like a Peace Corps.
Okay, and
yeah, so for the last 30 years, I've really been working on things that are important to change the lives of people, particularly people who live in poverty. But the key thing, I think, is that I see blockchain as something that's going to exponentially improve that. So for a long time, you know, it's hard slog working with things like poverty and inequality, and things don't move fast. But I see the opportunity if we can actually get some decent proofs of concept, show that it can work, and figure out both the financial and execution models to take it to scale, it can really change the lives of people.
Okay, so look, I'm going to unpack some of that later on, but I'm going to go back to like your personal story first, because I want to kind of understand that as well. You've got, I mean, tell me about how you've got kids, right? They're kind of young but grown up. How do you feel about where the world is going for them? I mean, are you worried about?
Not really. I mean, to be honest, and I'm an optimist by heart, but I find the younger generation actually quite inspiring. My son runs accelerators and co-working spaces, and I spend quite a lot of time both with him and his startups and also with the blockchain community around the world. And I find, a lot of optimism and ambition in the young people that they can do things that are going to make the world a better place. And, every day you see people coming up with ideas that could improve things. So I actually think this generation is going to be able to make very positive change in the world, and I feel optimistic about the world.
Okay, that's good. And I know you let's say mentor a lot of young or younger executives and a lot of younger coders, but we'll go to there in a second. So look, you've dived in there already of talking about blockchain quite a fair amount. Blockchain, quite typically, we think of nerdy coders and women, nerdy dudes and nerdy girls sitting in rooms. How the hell did you get into blockchain?
Well, it's a story which is one of these tales that you regret for a moment. My son told me in 2010 that there was this new digital currency coming out and that I should buy some, and I wish I had. So I totally disregarded that piece of advice. And then a couple of years ago, he said to me, "Oh, Mum, there's this new technology called blockchain. You should have a look at it. It's sort of built on the same platform as Bitcoin." So I started having a look at it, but it didn't really grab me until one day I'd been reading about it and I was thinking about it. And suddenly my mind went to the Banda Aceh tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, which we worked on the reconstruction. And I suddenly thought, because it wasn't just the loss of life that was so devastating, and it was, but no one knew who was there and who wasn't there. So it took a long time to understand, who had survived and who hadn't, because all of the records had been washed away. And so people's identity wasn't known, all the land records were washed away, all the health records were washed away, all of the bank records were washed away. And then the donors came in their droves, and no one really knew whether the right people were getting their money or not. And I just had this moment and I thought, my goodness, if we had actually had blockchain being implemented in Banda Aceh, while it wouldn't have taken away from the tragedy, it would have so improved the rehabilitation period. And so that was the moment that I just decided to seize this and to learn about it and understand it, and then think about how to actually get it implemented on the ground.
Okay, so for a lot of people, blockchain is this kind of fuzzy thing that they don't kind of understand. It's kind of Bitcoin, but then people talk about it like it's this magic wand that just does stuff. What is it about blockchain, from your point of view, that makes it so important?
So I think the three aspects for me. One is the immutability of the record. So once something's up there, it can't be changed. The second thing is the fact that it's decentralized, which again, I think makes it more secure. And the third thing is then the peer-to-peer aspect of it, because it takes out the intermediary in transactions.
Okay, so look, I'm probably going to pretend I understand a little less than I do, just because I want to try and get in there and also, to be honest, try and work out how to explain this to other people as much as anything. So I'm using and abusing you, so I apologize. Why is immutability important? Is it corruption? Is it, so immutability means like it's carved in stone, right? Once it's down, it's down. That's
right. So an example that I was just talking about last week when I was in London, we did a panel on data quality and integrity in clinical trials. And so in clinical trials, there are things called lab books where they put an entry in at any particular time about exactly what's happening in the trial. And that's critically important for the veracity of the clinical trial. So anything that requires you to know that a transaction has taken place and is recorded and can't be changed. Another example that, is a really interesting example that I saw in Ottawa. All around the Western world, we have a huge problem with overuse of opiates. And one blockchain startup has created a project where you go to the doctor, you want to get a prescription, he puts it onto the blockchain. The prescription then is, so you have some sort of digital identity. The prescription then is made available to every pharmacy in the city. You can go and get your prescription from the pharmacy, but you can't change the prescription, and you can't go to 6 doctors and get the same prescription 6 times, which is, of course, what we have a problem with now. So it solves many problems, not just from a point of view of tracking of finances, but anything where you need to track and trace, and you need to know absolutely that that event took place at a given time. The other one, of course, that's being used is around provenance. So there's a company called Everledger that is looking at the track and trace of blood diamonds to ensure that the diamond industry isn't getting blood diamonds and selling them. So if you want to really know the provenance of something, then blockchain is a really good solution for that.
Okay, so it sounds like it's, basically using big data, the fact that everything is computerized, we can do things in a really different way. I mean, the one thing I've been thinking about, tell me if I'm right or wrong, is like everything we've done so far on the internet has been about doing things the way we used to, but putting on computers. And if you're turning the sound down, that's great. But right now it seems like all this new technology, what blockchain and AI and other like fourth industrial revolution tech is doing, is it's doing things in a way natively that is just different. So just the same way that lots of people say millennials use computers or their phones differently because they were born with it. Is that right? You're nodding, but I'm not.
Yeah, no, I was nodding because I think for our generation, we have to unlearn a whole lot of things that we learnt, because this really challenges the way that we've been brought up to think about how things operate, particularly the decentralized nature of it. And I constantly talk to people who then keep on thinking there's a central server somewhere that controls the network. And that's very hard for us to think about. But I think it's also hard for us to think about what future careers there will be, and all sorts of things that are going to change as a result of these disruptive technologies. And of course, it's not just blockchain, because you mentioned big data, it's blockchain, it's AI, it's machine learning, it's big data, it's IoT. So all of these things will converge to make significant change to the way that we think about things and the way we engage with people and the way we lead our lives.
That's really interesting. So I know decentralization is something to get your head around. I'm looking at what they're calling DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, for maybe stuff that I do or will be part of. You're saying a lot of people have their problems getting their head around it. Explain what it is and why it's important.
This is a challenge. Thank you very much. No, but look, I think these are really important. And when I think about it, I think about these DAOs or DACs, depending on who you're talking to, can create mass movements for social change for good. So, for example, one of the areas that I've been quite active in working on is around climate change, climate finance, green prosperity, and have been talking to groups like the World Wildlife Foundation, Panda Labs. And I think that people are going to organise themselves in groupings that cross the boundaries of countries as we know them and form around issues that they care about. So I think that this is going to be quite disruptive, in the current social order, if you like, where sovereign states are going to be undermined by the fact that their people can organise with anyone all around the world on important issues. So I think there's going to be some change in the whole global governance architecture if and when this all starts to take place. But already people are forming around issues and ideas that are well beyond the boundaries of sovereign states.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, and just to make clear, I want to talk about the specific projects you do maybe a little bit later on, but right now I want to try and understand the context a little bit more. So I want to do two things, talk about governance in a second, but please go back and put your business head on, your business leader head on. DACs, I'm assuming decentralized autonomous companies.
No, they're collectives or communities, depending on who you're talking about.
So, all right, but I'm going to go back to what I wanted to say. Which is,
sorry.
Yeah. All right, the commercial side of it. So, you're a person who's run really huge businesses. Some people are talking about running businesses in this way where maybe there's no CEO, maybe it's run a bit more like a co-op and people vote. Do you see that as something that might happen, that is one of many things that might happen as the future?
I'm probably a little less optimistic about that ideal, completely decentralized organization where people vote. And it's been interesting having conversations with people out there in the community. I suspect that ultimately these organisations will have various layers of participation and some form of governance structure, even though it's not a centralised organisation. And in talking to different people around it, they're talking about, having tokens for investors, having tokens for people who can give an intellectual contribution to whatever the project is, having tokens for beneficiaries that don't have to pay for them, but they're important participants in thinking about how to solve the problem. So I don't see yet a completely distributed organisation that has no form of governance or organisation in it. But then that's something I have to unlearn, but I'm not seeing it yet.
No, I get it. I mean, I think we've had this conversation where I study, and it's always in the front of my mind. I studied classical civilization and Athens, which had the very first democracy, and they tried direct democracy where everybody voted on everything. And that's when you get leaders, say a Trump or a charismatic leader, they convince people to do stuff that isn't the right way, where maybe if you have an expert making a decision, that makes a difference. All right, but I'm going back to your conversation now. Tokens. Explain tokens. Is it like being a member of a club? So if you're a member of the club, you get to vote and you can be a VIP member or a junior member. Is that what it is?
I think it's like being a member of a club, but as I look at a lot of these coin raises that are going around now, people are sort of reinventing consistently about how this is done. So I'm watching a few now that aren't just about money, but it's that point that I mentioned before about being different forms of participation. So I think it is like being a member of a club, but different people are in the club for different reasons. So different kinds of tokens can represent different things. But in the end, it's digitization of some form of value.
Okay. All right. So it's represents something. So it's kind of money, kind of a passport, kind of a member's card, kind of a credit card, kind of a share ownership. It's, am I being stupid and not quite fully grasping it? Or is it a matter of the fact that tokens are still evolving and developing and nobody quite knows what, apart from maybe some clever people, nobody quite knows what they are just yet?
I think that it's still evolving and developing, which was why I said I'm on a few channels now watching people who are developing new ICOs, and there's one group who are calling it an IBO, which is an initial bounty offering. So I think people are inventing new ways at looking at this every day. And there's another one that I'm looking at the moment that's introduced proof of caring. So they're saying no one can join their token community unless you do something that demonstrably shows you care about this token community. So I think it's absolutely evolving, and we're seeing it evolving in front of our very eyes.
I think you're my walking glossary of blockchain terms. That's awesome. So, and you also, just to pick up one point there, you spoke about channels. So you're on lots of like chat rooms, like on Disrupt, Slack, not Disrupt, but my brain's going. And you just follow what they're doing, right? Because they're open and they're being transparent about what they're doing, or?
Well, it's various. I run a few Slack and Telegram channels. Usually, no, they're all purposeful. I mean, they're all either they're open or specifically they've asked me to be part of the conversation. I mean, I don't randomly go around stalking Slack channels.
But in general, though, that's where people are conversation. So it's not people talking on the phone. It's not people going to conferences.
No,
Not people sitting in silos. It's people being really transparent and chatting about what they're doing and asking.
Well, absolutely. And the channels that I'm on with some of the ICOs are open to anyone who wants to get on them, as far as I can see.
Okay, so, and the reason why I was pushing there as well is, obviously the working title for this movie is Radical Transparency, Weapon of Mass Liberation.
Yeah.
And I know it's not quite the tech, but it seems to be the underlying ethos of a lot of the blockchain, AI, big data kind of tech. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, where you have the complete aficionados, for them, it's all about that. It's all about transparency. It's all about decentralization. It's all about disruption. But I think there's a spectrum of people, some of whom are right down there and some of whom are a little closer to the middle. And others, I think, who are saying, well, what can we use that's good of this technology and apply it to our businesses, but we're not going to be open and transparent. We're going to use it for commercial advantage.
Okay. Also, there's this concept which I find really interesting of nested permissions, which means how much information do you see? So as an example, just to vocalize it, if you're doing, like we were looking at movie contracts, actors or even like staff members don't necessarily want to have their salary like announced to everybody, but you might see that they have a contract and there is a relationship and they are working with you. Is that, yeah? Okay, so we've spoken around that area. Earlier you mentioned global governance architecture, and I've got two questions around that. It seems to me that this kind of, the governance architecture or how you run an organization, it seems to be that in blockchain, a lot of people are saying the same things about companies and organizations as they are about like government, like actual sovereign governments. Is that right or is that wrong? Or am I understanding it right? Sorry, am I understanding what they're saying correctly?
I don't know the answer to that. So, and I don't think companies and governments are the same. So I'd rather talk about them separately, because the issue for government, which I think is important, is generally the government thinks that it can exert some sort of control and influence over the citizens in a geographic space. And I think that blockchain changes that quite significantly. The other thing that I think blockchain can change, and you know that there are several democracy platforms around, is the speed and cost with which the government can interact with its citizens. So it's far cheaper and far faster for the government to be able to get citizen input into, you know, major policy decisions. So I think it's that lack of capacity to be able to constrain what happens geographically or even regulate what happens geographically that's going to affect governments as people form in organisations that cover multiple countries and possibly even the globe. And the second one is governments are going to be expected to be far more responsive than they've been. Because if you're in a democratic system where every 3 to 5 years you have one big election, people vote you in, and pretty much after that you do what you want for 3 to 5 years, I think all of that's going to significantly change, and governments are going to be in much closer touch with their citizens and be expected by their citizens to be more responsive to them.
Okay. Yeah, and I have to say, I sometimes forget things I've learned in various meetings before I get on these calls, but I'm sure you know that. All right, going back, you said sovereign governments have got some challenges, you know, the world is changing. You know, you can talk about it in whatever aspect you want, whether it's from an NGO or a business point of view, but could you unpack some of that for me from your viewpoint?
Well, I don't really understand it myself, because I think, like all of us, we're trying to figure out what this means. I think that where we will go is that the city is going to become a much more important point of governance than what we now know as governments that govern countries, because people living in a geographic area are going to want to have services and are going to want to have access to healthcare and access to proper transportation and so forth. So I think that the city is going to become a much more important part of government, if you like, in the future. What I'm not clear on is if citizens start organising beyond the geographic boundaries of our current sovereign state governments, what's going to happen? Because the sovereign state is a relatively new concept, in the annals of history. So the fact that we have them doesn't mean that we will always have them, that people can't choose to organise in alternative ways. But what I have no idea, and I haven't thought through, what does that mean for the kind of global governance architecture, the UN and these bodies that we currently have that, are supposed to look after the world, if you like. I'm not sure what's going to happen to them because they're based on a member state participation. And if member states change, then I think whoever these organisations of people are going to be, how they're going to connect when they have to deal with whether it's a global pandemic or whether it's climate change or issues where different groups have to interact. I don't know what the future will be for that. But I suspect it will be different than what we have now.
That's interesting. I suspect it may take several decades, if not 100 or 200 years, because this stuff takes a long time. And it's interesting. I agree with you, and I think, we're in the UK, or I'm in the UK right now, where Brexit is going on, how there are these fights pulling between globalization and people who are thinking more locally, or don't want to connect with the rest of the world, perhaps. Tell me, I'm fascinated by this concept of city states almost. I mean, again, like I said, I'm in London right now. This city has changed when it had a mayor that kind of runs it. So in the US equivalent, it's a little more like a state now that has a lot of control over a lot of services. What are your thoughts on cities and why are cities, like, is it just because they're more discrete geographical areas?
Well, I think cities are incredibly important because 70% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. So cities is where the majority of the people will be. And I think because cities is the grouping where people live, they need to form communities, they need to have services. I think that that's what's going to bind people together in terms of wanting to have some form of self-organisation or governance is going to be the point rather than countries. If you look at the map of the world and you see how urbanisation is really changing things, I think we've got to focus a lot on the future of the city, how to govern cities and how to keep cities safe and make sure that people have services.
Okay. All right. So look, just before we dive into like the projects you're involved with, to finish this part of the conversation off, looking around with the knowledge you have, where I know you're on a plane almost constantly, London last week, New York this week, Australia next week, and you know this subject really well. What are your thoughts about the next 10, 20, 30 years with blockchain AI? What are your hopes? What are your worries? What do you think might happen? What are the big things that just crop up in your mind?
Well, my hopes and my focus is that we can bring enough people round to the realisation, because people are incredibly ignorant of this. Governments are ignorant of it. A lot of the major global bodies are ignorant of it. Big companies are ignorant of it. So I think the first thing is getting people's attention to start thinking about how these different disruptive technologies are going to change things, but how to move fast to harness them for good. And so, my mission at the moment is to try and get people thinking about this, move as fast as possible to get proofs of concepts in developing countries that show how this can be used, work with people to be able to scale it, because I think there's a two-track process at the moment, because none of the platforms are perfect. They've all got problems. So the platforms I see as a bit of a race for the moon, but everyone's racing for it. So I think that problem will get solved. And then in the meantime, I don't think we wait for the platform. We start developing the apps. We need to test them in the settings at least in the case of my interest in emerging economies, try and make them work and then think about how to scale them. Because I think there's an issue with, if you're thinking about the bottom million, how you actually finance that, because a purely commercial model might not work for that. So there might need to be a mixed model to scale for the bottom billion. So they're the three things that, I think needs to be done: is solve the platform problem, get working on the good technology and get them working, start in one country and maybe do trials across several countries and develop the plans for scaling, and then look at the financial model to be able to scale.
Okay, so I pick up the advice you're giving there is don't put all your energy onto, well, let me replace that. Let me start again. What you're suggesting is put all your energy into what you want to achieve and worry a little less about the tech you're going to use, because the tech is going to change, but the end goal is, okay.
Yeah, I think so, because, Google wasn't the first internet search engine. There were lots of internet search engines that we all knew that now don't exist, and Google kind of won the race, and I think it's going to be like that as well with the platform.
Okay, so Jane, open your diary for me. Where have you been the last 12 months?
I've been to Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Serbia, US, UK several times, Nepal, Chhattisgarh in India, Canada, Hong Kong. That's a good start. Possibly.
Okay. So I think you have projects in all of those places, if I remember correctly. So let's go back and talk about sustainable models. Well, actually, no, let's start with that, because we've been talking about business. Talk to me about sustainable models.
So let me try and think about it in this way. So a lot of work that typically happens in foreign aid and international development, which is where I've spent most of my life working, isn't sustainable. So it's a lot of, we'll give grants to an NGO to help victims of HIV or something like that, and it's often not integrated into government systems, and it's something that when the donor stops giving money, it finishes. So what I think is important in the blockchain side of it is that if donors get involved, and they get involved at trying to accelerate the development of the applications, and then work with the private sector to develop scalable models. Because in the end, I think if it's not commercially sustainable, then we're going about it in the wrong way. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the challenge to my thinking. So I don't think it's purely commercial, because no one's going to fund that acceleration of the applications that are going to solve social problems. And I think that that's a place, where donors and philanthropists can get involved. But when you get it to the point that you've got the tech developed and you see that it can work, then I think it needs to commercially scale. But you might, let's say for the poorest of the poor, there might be some arrangement where the application company provides free access to their application for certain settings or something like that, but they can commercially scale it in other places.
All right, so maybe, and I apologize sometimes if I interrupt, I'm not trying to talk over you, I just want to make sure I understand. So from my understanding, what you're telling me is right now, a lot of NGOs and charities, they've just been giving money away. They're emptying their wallet. If I had a wallet here, and just emptying out the cash, not sustainable. Whereas the blockchain way is maybe a little more like setting up a trust. So you in terms of the fact that it keeps going, a trust keeps a bunch of money, it earns interest. So, and your eyes are looking blanks, that's not the right description.
No, I don't think it's the right description. And I don't want to be on camera saying that all NGOs don't do anything except give money. So,
okay, no, all right. Let me put it a different way. One of the big successes in recent years has been Tom's Shoes. It's a company that's a profit-making company, but it also gives shoes away. Yes. So it's kind of doing work that a charity, for want of a better word, would have done years ago, but it's doing it in a way that is run like a business. And blockchain makes it easier to run businesses that do social good at the same time.
That I agree with. I still don't know if that's the model to go forward with, but I totally agree with what you're saying in that regard.
If we're talking directionally, because I think the challenge, I think, and why I want to even make this movie or this TV series, whatever, is a lot of these concepts are really hard to understand. So I'd rather sometimes use descriptions, if I'm being honest, that are 80% right, but you kind of get it, than ones that are 100% right, and you're like, yeah, not quite certain. Anyway, that's me. That's not for this conversation.
Maybe but I do want to. The point about Tom's shoes that I think isn't the same is Tom already was making shoes, and then started giving a pair of shoes away to poor countries. That's different. So Tom had shoes. That's different from when you don't have the tech, you don't have an application, and you're developing the application to do something. That's what I think is the difference there.
Okay. All right. So it's born different.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, I think that might come out.
Yeah, but I think the idea of having something commercially successful that also makes a contribution to social good, that's correct. But I think it doesn't go in the same way as Tom's shoes.
Okay. All right. No, that's, I picked a bad example and I've got to think of a better one, but what you just said is very clear.
I'll try and think of one too. I haven't.
So look, there's two ways of looking at this. One of which is what the project's doing, and maybe what I'm going to ask you is what are the three projects you're most excited about that you've helped instigate or you're involved with in some way, and why?
Well, the first one is the ID Box project, which was born out of the hackathon at London Blockchain Week last January. And we, Apt Associates, along with the Bank of Papua New Guinea, sponsored the hackathon, and we gave people a real live problem, or we gave them two problems from Papua New Guinea, one around financial inclusion and one around citizen services. And the ID Box was one of the winners, and it was created by Julian Bootaloo, who created a device that is able to take a digital ID, hash it onto a blockchain, using only 2G mobile phone, doesn't require electricity and doesn't require internet. And for me, that's game changing in terms of the bottom billion or the last mile, because these people don't have smartphones and they don't have good internet if they have internet at all. So we need to find blockchain solutions that are going to be able to reach people who have very poor infrastructure. And so this device, we've already done a proof of concept of it in Papua New Guinea, and we've got plans along with the Australian government and the Bank of PNG to scale that up to a district level during this year. It's been shortlisted by UN Women as a device that UN Women see potentially is going to be game changing, and we'll be taking it to New York at the end of January. And I've just recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Chhattisgarh in India to do a proof of concept on the device there. So I guess my dream for the device is that we can get proofs of concepts in probably 3 different countries, get some financial support to do that, and then look at, if it's successful, this is something that could scale, and this is something that could really change things majorly, because the 3 things that it does, one is it'll take a digital ID in some form of biometric. Second, it will send and receive digital currency. And third, it actually will allow for off-grid micro trading of solar power. So it actually could assist with the powering the villages.
Okay, I'm gonna, there's a lot to unpack there, and that last bit is interesting, and it sounds like a magic box.
It does sound like a magic box, and if we can make it work, it'll be absolutely awesome.
All right, so I'm also interested in the stories behind these people. You mentioned Julian there, or Julian, and I've heard someone describe him as potentially like the next Elon Musk, this genius, I guess, for want of the better the word. Tell me about him a little bit, and tell me about him first, actually.
Well, obviously I met him at London Blockchain Week. The thing that really impressed me about Julian, I was a mentor. He came up to me and he said, I've got this idea for Papua New Guinea with AI, and he started telling me about it. And I said, no, look, that's not going to work. And then he intensely questioned me for about 20 minutes, but really listened to everything that I said, because I was explaining to him the context. And then he just went away and built this amazing thing. And
so let me go in there. He's an interesting person, and we'll try and talk to him hopefully soon. So everything, when we think about blockchain and AI, we think of things in the cloud, software. This is an actual
device. It's a box.
So it's a box, and why is it a box? So explain to me.
I think you have to interview Julian for that.
Okay.
But it's basically it's a box that enables these things to happen. But he's continued.
All right, let's go at it a different way. It's a box that sits in like a community room, a community hall in a village that has nothing. Yeah. So I think as we do the proofs of concept, I think we're going to refine where the box sits, who has it, because it's almost, so our original concept, I shouldn't say ours because it was his, the original concept was that it would sit in a school or a church or a community hall, and then people could come and, use the box in order to register their identity. So it started purely... And this is because it's Papua New Guinea. So these are for people who don't understand, these are the very poor people in villages that have very little infrastructure in terms of electricity and mobile.
They have, 85% of that population are unbanked, and less than 30% are actually registered in terms of, birth registration. And they have no electricity and are often, 6 to 10 hours either drive or walk from somewhere where they might be able to, for example, receive money. So a really powerful example, I think, is where we did the proof of concept for the ID box is about a 7-hour drive from Port Moresby over very rough roads. So if I am a relative working in Australia and I want to send money to my relative in the village, let's say I've sent $200, they have to take a bus for 6 or 7 hours. That costs 60 kina to go get the money from Western Union or the bank, which will probably take at least another 30 off the top, and then pay another 60 to go home to the village. So it's cost them 150 kina to get the 200 kina that I've sent. And so this is what can change. If you think about that, if you think that we could directly send digital currency or value to the people in the village, and then they can exchange it for goods or for fiat currency, that's a massive change, because they save $150 and they don't spend 3 days out of the village going to get the money.
All right, and fiat currencies are just old-fashioned money that we're always having in our wallets, right?
Yeah, that's right.
New word for it. All right, so that sounds like I understand why it's important, and I guess digital ID has other uses, right, for NGOs as well. I mean, I've spoken to some people, actually another project that you told me about with Val and Bakir in Indonesia. So we've covered that in a different area. What are the other benefits, do you think, of this box? What do you see it? I mean, I'm not trying to mean that it's got great benefits already, but I think
identity
start of something.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of things that can hang off this. So first of all, I mean, identity is key to being able to vote, is key to being able to have a bank account if you want one, is key to being able to borrow money, is key to being able to register any assets that you have. So identity is really a key piece to the whole blockchain story. So if people have an identity, I think a number of things beneficial things are going to come out of that, because it's going to enable them to participate in the economy in ways that they currently don't participate. So in many villages, not just in PNG, but outlying villages in rural and remote areas all around the world, many people are barely in the cash economy, but could be, because maybe they produce food, maybe they produce handicrafts, maybe they have land that is an asset that they can borrow against to start some kind of business. So it opens up a whole lot of things that aren't currently available to them.
Okay, all right. So what other projects excite you right now?
So the other one that I'm excited about, but I need to raise money for, is Chattisgarh, because that was a real surprise to me, because it was something that I just connected to over the internet. Someone from Chattisgarh connected me and said, we really want to do some work in social inclusion. We have 50%.
So just for context, sorry, you're talking about right now an area, a state in India.
Yes, it's one of the poorest states in India. So someone reached out to me on LinkedIn, said they wanted to learn about blockchain. I sent them a whole lot of information about blockchain. He then contacted me again and we had a call, and he told me that they had, as I said, they've got 50% of the population are tribal and poor and hard to reach, and that they want to make sure that every one of those families has a mobile phone and every one of them is able to access welfare payments and other benefits of government, and was very keen to learn about blockchain, and then asked me if I would come. So I went there, which was a bit of a mission unknown, but I'm so glad that I did, because, you know, I went and they had really inspiring plans to change the lives of the poor people of that state, and they wanted some technical solutions to help them implement their plans. So they have a roadmap, they know what they want to do, and they really want to use me as connected to bring some blockchain companies with solutions that are going to help with what they want to do, and do some proof of concepts, and if they're successful, to actually scale them to change the future of the people of that state. And that would be so exciting. In fact, if you were able, so we've already got a government engaged and connected and with plans, because you don't always have that. They know what it is they want to do, they know what blockchain can do, and they want to be able to implement that. And that could be really world changing for that state, and it would be incredibly exciting to be part of something like that.
Okay, so that may be one we should look at if we're looking for somewhere to film, and Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, where you sent me. So I don't want to touch too much on Indonesia and Jakarta and the I Am project, which you told me about, because I've interviewed 2 people there already. But I know what came out of that was you're helping a lot of people help themselves. So the project in Indonesia was about people taking micro jobs to a certain extent, being able to earn their own money. But I've also had a lot of talk about NGOs using blockchain to help track funds and maybe operate in a different way. I think we had a conversation when you said maybe we won't need NGOs in a little while because, oops, sorry, I just had a pop up in my window there. You spoke a little bit how maybe in 10 years NGOs won't exist, or they'll be different.
I think they'll be different. I don't think they won't exist, but there's a whole layer of work that companies like ours and NGOs do, which is really looking after the money for the donor. For example, if you look at the Global Fund for TB and malaria, they employ they spend a huge amount of money in many countries around the world. They employ a local fund agent in every country that they work, basically to make sure that their funds don't get stolen. Once you get the blockchain solutions working, anything that really is money going from a central agent to a beneficiary, it can be directed through a smart contract to that beneficiary for a particular purpose. Then you're not going to need an intermediary looking after it and tracking it. So that's a very important disruption, I would say, to our business, and will be to NGOs' business, and I think it will enable donors. Also, one of the areas that I've been active in discussing and quite excited about is in the area of climate finance, because it's going to enable the climate finance flows to get much more quickly down to the beneficiary communities and much more directly without the bureaucracy that's around it. So I think once people have developed those solutions. And we were working, when I was in London last week, with a tech company in London to start looking at how to do it with our own financial flows, because our company manages large amounts of money for donors, which we then pass down to local NGOs, and often they then pass it to other local NGOs in the form of grants. So we're actually looking at how we can deploy it within our own business to more efficiently trace the money that we manage on behalf of donors.
All right, so that's, in a way, that's quite a challenge for individuals, because sometimes it may be doing yourselves out of a job or doing your charity out of a job, but ultimately the winner is the people you're meant to be helping, I guess.
But I think, you know, for every company, for every NGO, then I say disrupt yourselves. And that's what we're trying to do, is think about what this disruption's going to do and then get ahead of it in terms of what your business model is and how you think things are going to work moving forward, and get ready.
I think you and me, I follow and completely agree and try and do that as well. Look, I could speak to you for hours and hours about so many of these subjects and dive into it, but before we go today, actually two separate areas. We haven't touched on kind of universal basic income. I guess this goes back into the question from half hour ago about sustainability. You know, a lot of people are talking about universal basic income, universal healthcare as this kind of thing that's going to happen because of blockchain and because of these new decentralized organizations and new ways of working in tokens. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm yet to be convinced. I've spoken to a lot of people who are talking about it. So universal healthcare, it's an ideal. People have been talking about it since back in 1976 with primary healthcare. It's the same thing with a different name. I'm a bit of a skeptic as to whether we'll achieve that, because I just know what it takes to deliver healthcare in really difficult areas, and I know the state of healthcare in many developing countries, and I just can't see it, at least can't see it in my lifetime. The universal basic income, I mean, I'm kind of attracted to it. It's an idealistic concept, but I think the jury's out on whether it will be universal and how it will be used. And then, you know, that's the social question, isn't it? Because part of the universal basic income idea is when people don't have to work to earn money and they get a basic income, where do people get meaning from? Because at the moment, many of us get social meaning through our jobs. And then if we don't have jobs and we have money, then what's going to give people meaning in their lives? And I think that's a big social question.
Okay. All right. And one thing I don't think I've really touched on so far, but obviously be my final area to talk about is, so technology, Silicon Valley, Google, all famously male-centric, all famously white or white and Asian by Asian, or Asian. And through you, through other people, I'm meeting lots of people, lots of women, lots of people from diverse backgrounds. It seems to me a lot of the interesting stuff happening in blockchain isn't happening necessarily in America, isn't necessarily happening in Silicon Valley or around Dumbo in Brooklyn, where a lot of traditional startups are coming from. It's happening in the Ukraine, it's happening in Indonesia, Australia. And I feel like, maybe because I've made an effort, I feel like I'm coming across a lot of women working in the area, a lot of people making a change. Can you talk to me around your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting subject, because obviously tech is dominated by men. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, and I think part of it is our social prejudices or preferences in the way that we bring girls up. And I think that there is work to be done to really proactively encourage girls to go into science and technology and to create role models for them to see, because all of the, you know, if you see any of the tech programs, Big Bang Theory, Silicon Valley, they're all bunches of nerdy blokes. And then if anything, you've got like Penny in the Big Bang Theory, who's just a ditzy blonde. So we need to get some better role models for young women in that sense. But I actually think I really encourage women to work in tech because it's one of the occupations that you really can manage a family and work, because it's really flexible. You can work from home, you can work any hours that you want. So I'd be really encouraging women to think about tech careers, because managing a career and managing motherhood is a challenge. And I think it's a great career for women who also want to have families. What I see is interesting, and you'll see it too, is the sort of hashtag women in blockchain is really gaining a lot of momentum. And I'm on a channel at the moment, which is basically a women in blockchain channel, and people are joining up every day, and this community is really growing fast. And I think encouraging each other and giving each other strength is an important part of it. But I hope that we can see more of it. But what I say to women, and I said it to a group of women in blockchain in London last week, is don't look around and say there's no women in blockchain. It's up to you. You want to work in blockchain, you want to start a company, you want to do something, just go and do it, and stop worrying about whether there's too many men or anything like that. It's really up to every single one of us to be able to prove our worth, come up with a good idea, get a company, support each other, and be awesome.
Okay, it's one of the things I've noticed actually, that I'm seeing a lot of networks now of women mentoring or being mentees to each other moving forward. And I think it's worth saying you could be a woman in blockchain but have a male mentor, or a different.
Oh, of course you can. And I'm totally, I joined this. I've never been actually much of a joiner of these kind of women only things, and to some extent I share some of the disquiet of our male counterparts. But on the other hand, I think that we can learn from anyone. And so I'm absolutely agnostic to whether they're men or women, either to be mentors or to be mentored. I think anyone who's got a good project is deserving of support. And I absolutely think that men can be great mentors for women. So I think it's a kind of a gender-free space, but because the statistics are pretty clear about women in tech, I just think, if I can have a voice and encourage young women to do it and help them through, because I do think a big challenge for women is how to have a career and have a family. And I do think that that's an area that's not quite the same for men, and that's an area where people like me, who've managed to do both, can help them.
Cool. And I'll ask you one last question around this. So, and this is around women, and it's also around people from different countries and different backgrounds. It feels to me like a lot of the tech we've got right now comes from like the viewpoint of Silicon Valley, of nice white middle class people, the values of Facebook and how they, what's allowed up there, what isn't, is very much American West Coast. Do you feel like if there are more women, more people from poor or diverse backgrounds, we're going to get different kinds of tech, or tech will be exploited differently? Or am I just making stuff up?
No, I think we already are. But, because what I'm seeing, of course, is the tech communities in emerging economies. And I think they do think differently. They're much clearer on what their problems are that they're solving. They're much closer to it. They're also much closer to their culture and their religion and those other issues that need to be taken into account. I think I mentioned to you, I just met a young woman who is determined to fight terrorism and who's developed an app, or is in the process of developing an app to provide all of the correct interpretations, if you like, of the Quran. And I think that that's amazing. And, I would never have thought of such a thing, but so she's looking at the challenges within her own community and within her own religion and coming up with applications that can solve a big problem that we've all got. So you see really different things coming out of other communities, and I'm seeing it a great deal, and I'm thrilled to be part of it, to be honest.
Cool. So, and then this really is a final question, because I just thought about it. Help me. I've got a pet theory, which could be right or wrong. It feels like the stuff we've been doing the last 20 years has come from the top and filters down, and people at the bottom are users. It seems like blockchain and decentralized is very much about tech happening at ground level, and then maybe not even going up because there's decentralized, but it's ground up rather than top down. Is that a correct impression or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's part of the philosophy of the blockchain community as well, is being decentralized and being open source and being collaborative. Because that's the other part of it that, you know, I really notice amongst the community, and you touched on it earlier, is these Slack channels are wide open. Everyone can get on, everyone can have a voice, everyone can see the code. And this is so different from the way that we've all been brought up, the way that we, you know, have all seen the world and business and things unfolding. So it's a very, very interesting time, but it's one of great collaboration, and the ideas are coming from the problem holders, not from the smart people with a lot of money in the West.
Okay, and then you mentioned these Slack channels, women in blockchain, new people starting, any website they should go to, any list of these things? Do they just need to Google it to work out where these lists are?
Probably better if offline I just send you some links.
Okay, all right, well, I'll do that, and I will share those links on Twitter or something, if I'm allowed to, if they're not private ones. I'm going to talk to you more afterwards. This is the end of the interview, and we're going to be carrying on, and I hope to go to film some of the places where your projects are. But thank you so much for your insight. That was really very instructive and very illuminating. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me on the show.
Well, not quite a show, but yeah, thank you. All right, well, look, thank you very much. I'll see you later. Bye.